Welcome back. Variable ND filters vary quite a bit in their quality and in their price, and at the lower end of that scale they can suffer somewhat from vignetting or from cross-polarization, which is a kind of X pattern occurring across the image, which is highly undesirable. But I'm going to show you how you can create an adjustment in Photoshop that you can apply either to still images or to your videos in Premiere and almost completely eliminate those effects. But first of all, why would you want to use an ND filter? Well, principally you use an ND filter to cut down the amount of light that gets into the sensor, and so that allows you to have a longer exposure or a slower shutter speed. You may want to do this to create a visual effect of movement. You may want a really long exposure to smooth out water. You may want to get light trails from vehicles along the road. And it may be that you also want to use a relatively wide aperture, and so an ND filter will allow you to cut down the light and use a longer exposure or a slower shutter speed in order to get that effect. And it's particularly important in video because the best cinematic effect is when your shutter speed is 1/2 of your frame rate. So if your frame rate is a 25th of a second, then you would want a shutter speed of a 50th of a second in order to have a tiny amount of motion blur and create that cinematic smoothness of motion rather than the stuttery motion that you would get if you had a higher shutter speed. So supposing you also want to shoot at your widest aperture, something like f2.8 or f1.8, well, that's going to be impossible even with the lowest ISO unless you use a neutral density filter to cut down the amount of light and allow that combination of aperture and shutter speed to be possible. Now, of course, you can use a regular neutral density filter for that, but a variable neutral density filter is particularly useful because you can use it in a video situation where the light may be changing and you don't have to keep screwing filters on and taking them off again, which would be really cumbersome. So what many filmmakers do is they use a variable neutral density filter that will allow a range of 2 stops up to maybe 8 or 9 stops. So a variable neutral density filter works by having 2 elements of polarized glass, and each element is polarized to allow light of one particular polarization through either vertical or horizontal or whatever angle you've got them set to. And then when you turn those at cross purposes to each other, they don't allow any light through. When they're aligned, they allow pretty much all the light through and maybe just cut down the light by about 1 stop. But when they're crossed over, they don't allow any light through. Now, physics just basically creates some issues with that when you begin to get to the point where it's letting very little light through and you have this effect of vignetting around the outside, and sometimes an X appears, which is from the cross polarization, and that's undesirable. But most work fairly well up to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stops of neutral density, but once you get to 7 or 8, you get that effect. And what I'm going to do in this particular video is to show you how you can compensate for that by creating an adjustment in Photoshop that allows you to eliminate it out of your images or out of your videos and have a much more clean image and get the best out of your neutral density filter. Now, I've also put in the description quite a few neutral density filters that I have looked at and that you might be interested in exploring. They range incredibly from about $24 right through to $500, which is what you would have to pay if you're going to buy the Peter McKinnon Polar Pro neutral density filters, because they're $249 each. But in order to avoid that cross polarization and vignetting effect, what they've done is they've split the range into 2. So it goes from 2 stops to 5 stops, and then from 6 stops to 10 stops. So I guess if you want the full range, you need to buy both of those. But let's assume that you want to get the best out of a cheap ND filter, like one of the ones I've listed in the description. Then use this technique that I'm going to demonstrate to you now, and you can apply an adjustment that will eliminate almost all, 90% of the vignetting and cross polarization out of your images and out of your video. I've shot a number of images here that you can see within Lightroom, and they've been shot at aperture priority. So the aperture is constant at f2.8 and the ISO was constant at 100. So as I, between each shot, increase the density of the neutral density filter, you can see that the shutter speed will change to compensate. So it starts off quite high at a 1600th of a second, and then as I turn the neutral density filter to increase the density of it, we're down to an 800th of a second, we're down to a 400th. So each image is taken at 1 stop of increased neutral density filter. We're now at a 200th, we're now at a 100th, down to a 60th, and now down to 25th, and down to a 13th of a second. So this is with the neutral density filter as open as it goes. So that is around 1 stop of neutral density applied to the image. So this is 2 stops, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we're going right from 1 stop right through to 8 stops of difference. And as you look at these images, even though they've all been compensated for in terms of exposure, you can see that the vignetting is beginning to increase very seriously as we get to these images where the density has been really ramped up. And as we get to 8 stops of neutral density, you can see that the vignetting really is quite bad. And if we were to go any further than that, to 9 stops or 10 stops, we would begin to get complete cross polarization, which is a large sort of X coming across the image. So in these last 2 images then, I've taken a shot without the neutral density filter attached at all, and that's a 3200th of a second, and one that shot at a 50th of a second. So I believe that I'm getting somewhere around 8 stops of neutral density applied to that, but there is a significant effect from the vignetting, and partly that's because we're shooting at 24 millimeters, which is quite a wide angle lens on a full frame camera, and also we're shooting at quite a wide aperture. We're going to take these 2 images and we're going to use these to create the adjustment so that we're going to be able to adjust from this image that has the vignetting and the effects of the neutral density filter and a little bit of a color cast on it as well, as you can see there, and we're going to be able to convert that into the normal image that should have been shot if the neutral density filter had been absolutely perfect in every respect. So what we're going to do is select these 2 images and open them in Photoshop. So I've just selected them, I'll type Control E, and hopefully that's going to load Photoshop and open the 2 images for me. Okay, so here we have the 2 images open. This is the one without the filter, and this is the image with the filter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the normal image, which is this one, and I'm just going to drag it over on top of the other image. I'm holding down Shift to make sure that they're aligned. So I now have the 2 images in Photoshop, one above the other. There's the normal image, and this is the one with the neutral density filter applied to it. So I'm going to rename these just so that I know what's going on with them. So this is the top one, this is the normal image, so I'm just going to double click there and call it normal. And I'm going to double click this and change it to ND. I'm going to select them both and drag them down to duplicate them, and I've now got a copy of each of them. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get Photoshop to determine the difference between these 2 images. But before I do that, I want to eliminate a lot of the detail that's in this, because between the two images the clouds will have moved ever so slightly, and the twigs and branches on the trees and even the grass may have moved a tiny amount. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a blur to this, and I'm going to use just a simple Gaussian blur. Go to Gaussian blur, and I'm applying a blur of about 500 pixels. These are from my Sony A7R Mark II, which is a 42 megapixel camera. If you're running with something that might be about 24 megapixels, then maybe a radius of about 300 would be appropriate for that. But I want to completely blur out the content of this image and just simply leave the general overview of how the light and shade is in the image. So we say OK to that. Photoshop is applying the blur to that layer. I'm going to select the layer below it, and I'm just going to go to filter and take exactly the same settings here with the Gaussian blur. And then both of these images have now been blurred, and we'll be able to determine what the difference is between them. So I'm just selecting the normal layer, albeit it's been blurred, and I'm going to go to image, apply image, and the settings that I want for this is that I'm going to pick the layer which is the neutral density version of the blurred image, and I'm going to choose the blending mode of subtract. So basically what this means is that I'm subtracting the one image from the other and leaving just the difference between the two images. So we'll just say OK on that. So if I switch off this copy here and just bring that down above the ND filter, let me just switch off the normal one again. So what we've got is we've got the image with the ND filter here as it was shot before it was blurred, and we've got this difference image that we have sitting above it. And so what I'm going to do is just simply change the blend mode to linear light. And now by applying that adjustment to the neutral density altered image, you can see that it compensates for the vignetting that occurs. Now it's absolutely not perfect because you're losing a little bit of dynamic range in it, and you're also, because the filter is not optically perfect, it's not just as sharp as it would be in the corners. So here's the normal image and here's the corrected image. So it's corrected it a fair bit, but it hasn't corrected it 100%. Personally, I think it's good enough for most video circumstances, and anyway, I would really recommend that you don't go as far as I've gone and go to about 8 stops of neutral density. If you stick within the range of 2 to 5, which is what that Polar Pro from Peter McKinnon actually does, you'll find that there's a very small effect from even the cheaper neutral density filters, and it's well within the range that you can compensate for by using this technique. So what we have then here is an image that if you blend it with the neutral density shot image using linear light, that will enable you to correct it. And so what I would then do is I would just set the blend mode on this back to normal. Let's just select that and set that back to normal, and then we can save that image. So I'm just going to go down and save it as a PNG. So let's do export, quick export as PNG, and I'm going to just leave it at the standard. So I'm now in Premiere, and I have here a piece of video that was shot with the neutral density at the same settings that we use with those images in Photoshop. I'm just going to create a sequence from that, new sequence from clip. We have it here on the timeline. I'll press the / key in order just to extend it out, and we've now got a piece of video, but you can see that that video is suffering from the same kind of vignetting and color cast and artifacts that the still image was taken from. So in order to correct it, we're going to do exactly the same thing that we did within Photoshop. So I'm going to take the PNG that we created earlier, and I'm going to just drop it onto the timeline, and let's just move it along a little bit. And now what you can see here as I move along, well, we move into the image, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the blend mode to linear light, just as we did within Photoshop. And now, as you see, as we move along, this is it without the adjustment applied to it, and this is it with the adjustment applied to it. So as I say, not perfect, but it does a pretty good job of getting you back to where you want to be. So there's a technique that you can use to correct for some of the effects of neutral density filters, the cheaper ones, if you push them to the limits. My recommendation is that you don't push them to the limits. And here's something else to consider. If you have a variable neutral density filter that works well in the range of 0 to 5 stops, you could consider just simply purchasing a regular neutral density filter, not another variable one, maybe something that has 4 stops of neutral density. And if you put those two filters together, make sure it's not a polarizing one, by the way, because that will introduce added effects. But if you have a standard one and you put those two together, it will turn your 2-stop neutral density set at its minimum to 6 stops, and then as you move it up to 5, it will take you on up to 9 stops. So that could be a cheaper way for you to get a neutral density filter that works well all the way from 1 to 2 stops right up to 9 stops. Obviously, there may be some effects in terms of resolution and sharpness if you're putting 2 pieces of glass in front of your lens, but that is something that you may want to consider. So I hope you find this useful. It seems I'm losing my voice a little bit. I hope you find this useful, and if you did, then please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, and you'll get notified of any future videos. And if you give the video a like, it will be really helpful to me. So I will see you in the next one.